Daniela, as a 10-year-old girl, you had a near-death experience. Would you tell me how that came about and what you experienced? Yes, it was in the summer in the mid-80s, and I was growing up in a small village, which has a population of around 7,000. And there in this village, we have a local outdoor pool where I used to go with my sister, who is 2 years younger than me. I was about 10 at the time, as I said before, and we all went there together. I'm the eldest sister of 3 girls. There was just a short footpath leading to this outdoor pool, and we had a season ticket, an annual pass, and we used to always be accompanied by my aunt who looked after us. It was also she who was the one who taught me to swim in this pool. Well, in summer back then, I was swimming there in this pool. There too, as in every outdoor pool, there is also a children's pool, and with a large pool with the non-swimmer section in the front part, separated from the deep swimmers pool in the back part by a kind of rope. Well, now I was swimming in this deep pool, but rather close to the front part. I didn't swim all the way to the end of the back part because there were always lots of people romping around in that area. And now I was swimming a bit back and forth, but rather close to the edge of the pool, not in the middle of it, as I did not yet dare to do so at the time. I was still a bit too scared that something might go wrong when swimming around freely in the middle of the pool. Diving or anything like this wasn't my thing either. I only ever did it with my nose covered and my eyes closed. Even today, I still don't enjoy it, but swimming is wonderful. Well, when I was swimming around, what I would like to say is that this incident was in the mid-80s, so it was quite an old outdoor pool, probably built in the 70s, because the water surface, as well as the ground in today's pools, is flat. And as to this concrete pool wall back then, there was still enough space between the water surface and the place where you could get out of the pool. And as I said, I was swimming along when, as far as I can recollect, 3 boys came along who surrounded me and who might just have been a few years older than I, and they suddenly started, as if having conspired against me, to wildly press me underwater again and again. And what first perhaps looked like a game rather quickly became deadly serious for me, because the number of times I was pushed underwater by them and didn't have the time to come up got longer and longer, whereas the time for me to breathe kept getting shorter. So I hardly had the chance to breathe, because the moment I came up, I was already being pushed underwater again without having had time to catch my breath. And then indeed, the thought came to me quite quickly. I can't say how long this little game went on. Anyway, the thought came to me quite quickly, if they don't stop, they're going to kill me. And just as I was thinking about that, it happened, according to my memory, that I had left my body and was practically experiencing from a somewhat higher vantage point that I was still underwater. Yet I was looking at the whole scene, how these guys were pushing my body underwater again and again. I saw the air bubbles around me, the whole event. Also, this whole event within the outdoor pool with all the noise and so on. Even though I was no longer in my body, I somehow found myself on a higher level. But as I said, still underwater, I was able to perceive this picture underwater. My feet, as well as all the other people around there. I had an overview of all this. But at the same time, I found myself as if in a cocoon of silence, although I was perceiving that there was some kind of action there, whereas I was in the silence. And a great peace overcame me. It was a perfect peace. And in this state of being, I had no fear, no concerns. I was just an observer of what happened. And what was also interesting is that it was a sunny day. I can't say if it was June, July, or August. It was hot anyway, and the sun was shining. And a different kind of light beam seemed to break through the surface of the water. And to explain this from my point of view as an observer, I was watching from here what was happening in front of me. And this light beam was like, I can't say like a wall, but it formed a dividing line between this incident and me as a spiritual being, I'd say, or whatever I was at that moment, or as an astral body observing what was going on. As this was outside my body, even though I had no sense of time, it must have lasted, when looking at it with the logical mind, perhaps only a few seconds, or maybe less than a minute. But I merely was watching it all the while in this silence and contentment. And at the same moment, I was aware of all the things I just described. Within a fraction of a second, what? That's what dying is like? Oh, it's so easy. And then it went on as follows. If I today look at all these things rationally, in retrospect, and with my own logic, I would say that this awareness was a greater awareness than that of a 10-year-old child. Because in my opinion, a 10-year-old child is not able to have such an insight. That is, the ability to perceive things like that. Well, anyway, I realized quite logically that if these guys didn't stop what they were doing, because I somehow still had a connection to my body, and that's exactly why I knew that if they didn't stop, I simply couldn't hold out any longer. And the logical consequence was then, within this peace and without being in fear, that I would die. So the only consequence left was, then you take a breath now. So I made a very conscious decision to take a breath underwater, regardless of what the consequences would be, whether I would survive or whether I would be dead. And as for me, I was well aware that I would die if I took a breath now. And the moment I had finished thinking this thought, something suddenly grabbed me. It was like a suction. I felt a hand grabbing me, and I assume that I was back in my body at this moment. Thereupon, a suction was pulling me upwards, and as I described just before, there was a distance from the edge of the pool to the water surface. Then suddenly, I found myself sitting on the pool edge, and when I turned around, my hand was in the hand of a girl who was about my age. I looked at her, completely amazed, as if, how could all this have happened? I must well have recognized, even at my young age, that this was actually not possible for such a child to pull me out of this deeper part of the pool. I even don't know if an adult could have had an arm long enough to pull someone out of this water with the necessary strength. I was looking at the girl, then at the water. I looked around for the boys, who were no longer there. They were at the end of this deeper part of the pool, whereas I was in this front part of the pool when all this happened, and they were now at the end of the pool, where the springboards used to be, but they have since been removed, so they had not been there for many years. And those boys no longer took any notice of me. So I turned around in order to thank this girl, but she was no longer there. Thereafter, I think I went to my sister. That's what I can recollect. And we both were searching the whole area of the outdoor pool for this girl because I wanted to say thank you and because I really couldn't believe what happened. As I said, this outdoor pool area was not that big in a village of 7,000 inhabitants. The sunbathing area was easy to peruse, but I just couldn't find this girl. And the special thing about this near-death experience is the memory, not of being pushed down underwater, but of having had a near-death experience and apparently being saved by a supernatural being, maybe an angel. And this only came back years later, when I was in my early 30s. So I know that I must have lost the memory of this experience sometime when I was between 10 and 16 years old, because I had an experience at the age of 15 or maybe 16 in the same pool, even though in another place, where some boys I knew from my class surrounded me and started fooling around, also trying to put me underwater again. And I totally panicked and could well remember that something like that had happened before. But this memory of the near-death experience was already gone at this point. And in my early 30s, I was reading a book about angels by Diana Cooper, a short account about a girl who had an accident at the age of 10 in her parents' swimming pool, where somehow an electric cable was involved and she was supernaturally rescued by an angelic being. And the moment I read this report, a movie was somehow running before me with all the memories and all the emotions as described before, being completely back in my mind once again. I was so overwhelmed that first I was crying out of thankfulness that I had been saved. Thereupon, I called my sister that same afternoon, asking her if she could still remember the incident with the girl without telling her the further context, whereupon she confirmed immediately, "Well, can't you remember? We searched the whole pool area all day long for her." And she said, I talked about this experience for weeks, but the memory of talking about this for weeks had quite vanished until this very day. So, further, when you were about 21, you had another supernatural experience in the form of an exceptional dream where you met your late grandfather. Yes, that's right. As you said, I was in my early 20s, and my grandfather had passed away at 69, 3 months before his 70th birthday, and we had already organized a celebration for him. My grandfather was a really kind-hearted man, and I can't remember him ever saying a bad word. He was friendly to everyone and was very caring. And he was, just like my grandmother, very hardworking. They raised 6 children and 9 grandchildren. They only took holidays when they were younger in the mountains, as my grandpa loved hiking. But later on, they didn't go on vacation because they were always working. They really were only there for their children and grandchildren, and they tried to help everybody. Grandfather was a painter by profession, but he didn't just paint the walls and paint houses. He also painted landscapes in oil. And after he had retired, he painted outdoor signs for restaurants. So when he was about to turn 70, he told us that he really wanted to retire and no longer wanted to do anything except the things he enjoyed, like hiking and things like that. He then died in intensive care from several strokes within 3 days. And I was deeply shocked about this because he was the first person in my life that I had lost and that I really loved. So I was really deeply shocked that he had to die now. and that his wish could not be fulfilled. I should add that I had already completed my training as a nurse at the time, and my training included as well the teachings of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So we were also dealing with the issue of continued existence after death. So I was well aware of the fact that there are near death experiences, even if at this time I couldn't yet remember my own near death experience. But I was aware of a continued existence after death. And yet, this grief for my grandfather never let go of me because he wasn't allowed to live on. Well, I really was arguing with God, also struggling with myself. I was wrangling over destiny, the universe, and everything that is. Then one day I had a dream. I can't remember exactly when this was. It could have been half a year after his death, but also maybe a little earlier. So for me, it's more than a dream because I know that I was really there astrally. Usually, you can't remember dreams properly, and if so, they are often very confusing. They're not straightforward. You might forget them after a few years, but this dream was so realistic. So I'm nearly 50 right now, and for me, this dream still is as realistic and in front of my eyes as if I had had it right now, just today. In this dream, I found myself in a beautiful garden that seemed to be a kind of visitor's garden where there were beautiful, glowing paths laid out, not like the ones we have on Earth. These paths were rather shining in a light that I can't call a normal light. They were just shining, but not like the light we used to know. The sand, the gravel, all the bright stones I saw there, it all was shining from the inside out. And this somehow seemed completely normal, completely natural. And I can't say for sure whether the plants growing there even exist on Earth. But the whole thing wasn't laid out like an ornamental garden we think of as perfect. This garden was different. And even if there were weeds in between, even these were in a perfect arrangement. Everything was perfect. The colors in which the flowers and plants were shining, the trees, the grass, the air, if we can even speak of air here, it was filled with an iridescent light. But I can't say either that this light was the sun. It was shining brightly, and it was somehow as if this light, if I now say that it has an intelligence, I did not feel that way either. It's hard to put this into words, but this light had a very unique charisma. It also had something gentle, something good natured about it. Well, there were also little streams rippling along in this area. There were also bridges made of brick that somehow, in the form of a curve, were leading over these paths. And people were walking around us. And these people, among them my grandfather, were all dressed in light colored garments. These clothes were not completely white. There could have been shades of beige among them, but they were very bright, very luminous. The scenery there was not transparent, but not as compact and tangible as here on earth. The people there were talking, but I could not hear what they were saying. I just only noticed that they were talking to each other. Some children were playing in front of us. A few children were running in front of my grandfather, and me while he was showing me this beautiful garden. These children were playing with a ball that was bright, and they were happy and in a good mood. And just before we reached this bridge, or this kind of underpass, from where different forks in the road were starting, my grandfather said, "Now look how well I am. Look how nice it is over here. I'm in a wonderful place, so I don't need to be sad anymore." And when he said this, I woke up. And this dream, as I said, is still present today in all its reality. And from that day on, my grief was completely gone. So I didn't have to cry anymore. I was healed because I knew 100% that he was in a good place. Sometime later, you had a rather amazing incident when you saw your sleeping friend's astral body at night. How did this happen? Well, after this heavenly experience, as I call it, about 3 to 6 months must have passed before I had this experience, which I felt was the final touch to the whole thing. For me, the dream of my grandfather was reality. In any case, because I was definitely over there, but apparently I was still given this miracle as well. So I woke up at about 3 o'clock one morning, and my live in partner at the time was sleeping next to me. He was sleeping by the door, and I was sleeping by the wall. We had a bedroom facing the street, and as I don't like sleeping in the dark, the shutter was not fully closed. And in front of the house, there is a large street light that was shining into the room, making the outlines of the furniture and objects in the room somewhat visible. So I could still see something. As I said, I woke up and looked to the left and saw my partner's body lying there in the dark in bed and at a height of about a half a yard. So if I say here was his body plus the height of about a half a yard, then his complete astral body was hovering at this height above his physical body. Well, as I said, the physical body was lying in this shadowy darkness, and the astral body was gleaming in colors in the darkness. Now, you shouldn't imagine that this glow was illuminating the whole room, but rather a light was emanating from this astral body, allowing me to see colors in the darkness, even though the shining of the light itself did not reach far. It was just simply gleaming. If, for example, here in reality, the skin is naturally skin colored, when we look at ourselves, maybe it has a slight redness. This will slightly vary from person to person. And that's why the astral body was gleaming in the color of the skin. The lips, when they are slightly red, are gleaming reddish. The dark hair was gleaming dark according to the hair color. The body was bright, but I cannot say that I would have recognized clothing or anything like that. But it wasn't naked either. So it was somehow gleaming brightly. But the outlines of the arms and legs, as well as of the whole body, were still perceptible. When I saw it all, I sat upright in bed at a certain distance, cross legged, watching the whole thing. And even though it didn't feel like it was lasting only seconds, it felt like all of it was lasting, in fact, for several minutes. But I didn't have a stopwatch. So I was sitting there, and first of all, I was moved by the beauty. But at the same time, I also thought to myself, well, what's going on here? Then, as I said just before, I was already aware that there is life after death and that there are near death experiences as well. So then I thought to myself, what's going on here? Is he going to die now? Is this something coming out of his body, or what's going on? And I was fascinated and also moved by this beauty. At the same time, however, I thought as well, I must not wake him up now, because I don't know what will happen if I suddenly wake him up. So I just sat there, watching, because he was actually sleeping peacefully and breathing calmly. What was remarkable as well was a long stemmed rose protruding from his chest. Well, there was this green stem with leaves. I couldn't see any thorns. It was just absolutely beautiful. And there was such a large red rose blossom at the top of the stem. gleaming in a beautiful, bright red. At that time, years ago, I didn't realize that only later, when I was dealing with things like symbolism, that this rose can repeatedly be found in the context with Christ or on statues of the Virgin Mary or in paintings. But I still don't know what this means. It has remained a mystery to me. Some may associate it with the chakras. Anyway, there was a beautiful rose that didn't grow. It just protruded from his chest and was just shining. And as I was sitting there cross legged, observing all of this, I knew I was awake, but it occurred to me that I should pinch myself just to see if I was really awake and not dreaming. So I did, and I did feel the pain. And that way, I first had to put it all into perspective. And then all of a sudden, this astral body was sinking down into the body and was gone in an instant. And this didn't happen slowly, it was just bang and into the body. Whereupon the whole room was once again dark with these shadowy outlines, and the apparition was gone. Thereafter, I got up, and my partner at the time used to always sleep very deeply. Even when the light was on, he didn't necessarily wake up. So I got up very quietly. Then I went into the dining room to review the whole thing once again. So I took a handkerchief from the pack of handkerchiefs that was laying on the dining room table. I tied a knot into a paper handkerchief and put it on the table so that I would know that I had really left the room, and thereafter went back to bed and fell asleep at some point. We both worked morning shifts. He was a cook by profession, and he had to get up early on this day. And when I woke up, I don't remember whether I was on the late shift or if I was off. As a nurse, you sometimes have time off during the week if you have worked the weekend. However, on this day, I went to a woman. Well, we were living in a two-family house. The landlords used to live in the same house, but they moved out at some point, and as well rented out the lower portion of the house, and this part was relatively newly rented out. So this woman did not live here for that long, and she had two sons, and I knew that she had spiritual knowledge and that she was working with healing stones and dealing with things like that. So I consulted her because I was still asking myself what I actually experienced here, whether it was indicating something, maybe that he was going to die or something similar. I was really worried. She calmed me down by explaining to me that the astral body goes on journeys again and again at night during sleep, and that it can leave the physical body to which we are connected by the silver cord, and that only the physical body needs the rest for the organs, but the spiritual body would not be in need of a rest in this sense, and would therefore be able to leave the physical body again and again and go on journeys, for example, to the higher spheres. Or just as I experienced visiting my grandfather in my sleep, there is as well astral traveling, and so on. And she went on explaining to me that I was probably witnessing the return of the spirit body into my partner's physical body. I was in my early 20s at the time, and this just made sense to me, so I was reassured. However, I only read about this many years later in the relevant literature, and this gave me an even deeper insight. So I'd like to know, what impact did all these experiences have on your worldview? Yes, it was clear to me already in my early 20s that we are more than just this physical body. So, as I said, I believed in life after death. I grew up rooted in the Christian Protestant faith. Thereafter, we used to always be sent to the children's Sunday school, And also, we said prayers before eating, and my father taught us to pray before going to sleep. For me, all this gave me an accessibility to creation and an insight that life continues after death. Even though I cannot say how long I have known this, for me, this understanding somehow felt like it has always been there. But after these experiences, it was as if pieces of the puzzle were coming together, whereby more and more logic was emerging, although I was still very involved in my job, you see. In my early 30s, that is, after I had remembered my near-death experience, when I had recalled all of it, it seemed that more and more spiritually interested people, if I may put it this way, came across my path. So I got in touch with esoteric topics and somehow found myself in the midst of this subject matter. And that's how it is still today. And this is something that maybe shouldn't be. On the one hand, there is Christianity, and on the other hand, esotericism. And in between the big topic of reincarnation, which I believe in, well, there is still something that we haven't discussed, as I still had some other spiritual experiences in past years, including the one when I lost my husband 4 years ago in 2020. I also had post-death encounters with him. Maybe you and the viewers could decide whether it would be interesting for you to relate these experiences in another video. For me, in any case, more and more pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Since remembering my near-death experience, I have been interested in this issue for years now. That's why, of course, I am interested in near-death accounts, and I can see the similarities they have, whereby an ever greater logic is emerging as well. But it was only when my husband had passed away that I seriously started to thoroughly research it all. I can clearly answer the question, is there life after death? With a yes, for me, there is. Green check mark for that. What I'm interested in is why we are here. What is reincarnation all about? Why the whole thing happens at all? And what role God is playing in it? So I can really say, I know many people don't dare to say the name God, but for me, the search for God, this trying to get closer to Him, has really been deeply rooted inside me now for 4 years, even though I know that some people don't want to associate all of this with faith. But for me, this means a very distinct and strong longing. And it happens because all these individual puzzle pieces encompassing everything have come together. And for me, this has led me to start reading the Bible in 2020, and I am still doing so, but not to convert anyone in terms of faith, but rather with my mind and my experiences. I'm reading the Bible in order to understand what may be found in it about reincarnation and also about this or that topic that Christianity usually is interpreting differently, if I may put it this way, without intending to devalue anything. And during this research, I addressed God and asked, show me the truth. And I was most intensely guided during the whole time, and this still continues today. So I started reading various apocrypha, and am still doing so. I was led to Jacob Lorber, of whom I have only read excerpts, then on to Emanuel Swedenborg. I was also dealing with Johannes Graeber, and he was a great revelation for me. It was a time when I was intensely praying. So I was really led to Graeber, because before this point in time, I didn't know anything about him. And I also looked into Hans-Georg Gradl and the Brazilian Chico Xavier and a few others. At some point, of course, I also read parts of Beatrice Brunner's work. Not the whole library, of course. Maybe I'll manage it at some point someday, but I'm still working on it. And that's why it was important to me to do this interview with you, because I think you know a lot about this. And as for me, The more I read and compare what I've read with my own experiences, the more all these pieces of the puzzle come together to form a big picture. Excuse me for my expressing all of this as if I'm prophetizing, but I think we need to talk about such an issue. A year or two after my husband's death, I joined a large Facebook group dealing with the issue of life after death, where people can relate their post death encounters and near death experiences, but are also allowed to talk about their grief. I am an admin user there and read about these topics every day. I also post videos from YouTube in the group, or other group members do it. It depends. It's very important to me that we dare to talk about this, to spread the word about it. And one objection of general Christian culture as to this point of view is that if reincarnation really does exist, what is this life worth at all? And why should any further effort be done? As for me, I think the opposite is the case, because if we know about these things, we can recognize that this grace has been bestowed upon us, as well as the specific nature of the chance of being allowed to live here. Then we also recognize the gratitude we feel for being born, for having parents who gave birth to us, even if they were not the best of parents, because it is a gift in order to find one's way back to the divine. And when recognizing this, then, in my understanding, we bring light to the subject, but only when talking about it, thereby remaining in gratitude, so as not to, let me put it biblically, wander in the darkness without knowing why we are here. But if the light spreads, then we can do what Christians used to say, bring heaven down to earth. And even though we will never have here on earth the beauty that exists in the world beyond, we can still bring light to earth and really transform this planet, change it for the better. And at this point, we are back with Jesus Christ, who instructed us to follow him. And in the end, it is he who is the purpose of this reincarnation cycle that usually brings death and suffering. Thus, we all have our ailments and sufferings. Also, grief over my husband was difficult. So it is preferable to get out of the suffering, because this is no, as they say, walk in the park. Even in the groups, I see other people's sufferings. I think that being alone in old age or losing a partner is painful. But some people lose children, and this is a terrible pain. Well, this is my concern, my motivation, and what inspires me and also makes me very happy. Daniela, thank you for the interview. And I thank you